School was something that came easy to me growing up, but there was something that school uniquely did, and I give it credit for. And it may not have done this for you, it may have done other things to you, school that is, but school exposed me to great works of literature. It was something that was not on my radar in 11th grade. What was on my radar was somehow trying to figure out this thing called Jesus still, and whatever sport it was, that's what I was trying to kind of figure out. Those were the things that were on my radar. So my 11th grade English class put on my radar great works of literature that I would never have described as great before I read them, right? You give me a book called Old Man and the Sea, and I just didn't have much interest, right? Especially the cover to that book, terrible. An old man in an old skiff of a boat going out to sea, like I wasn't interested in that. And then we read this book with its cover, and I just wasn't that interested either from the get-go. But this book really made an impact on me. It's called Lord of the Flies. And it's a novel that tells the story of a group of young boys who, after their plane crashes on an island, they're deserted there with no adult supervision, right? So the book starts as something that I was like, really? People write about things like this? Like people spent time thinking about what it would be like in paradise with no adults, with a bunch of your buddies? All right, I will read this author. So I was interested, to say the least, at the beginning. This book quickly, though, became impactful in the way in which it invoked nightmarish images to me. The story goes on, and these boys are there, and this one boy finds a conch shell. His name's Ralph, right? And he blows in his conch shell, and all the other boys come up to him, and they deem him chief because he has a conch shell, and he's a good-natured boy. He's just like, oh, okay, I'll be chief, and he starts setting up some rules. And very quickly, the story starts unfolding into, I would say, a fear-filled nightmare that gripped me and haunted me. Because these boys immediately start dividing up into cliques, and the lust for power to be the chief drives these boys throughout the narrative. And truth be told, I felt that same kind of lust for power, for superiority, on the recess, muddy ground, playing two-hand touch football at recess. So it just connected with me where I felt these themes in my life. But here in the pages of this book, it was terrifying. The book continues to go about, and there's this myth that's believed amongst all the boys. I think it started by the main antagonist or evildoer. His name's Jack. He begins this myth that there's a beast on the island, and it is terrifying to all these little boys. You put my 9-year-old son on a deserted island with his buddies, and one of the buddies tells a scary fireside story about a beast that lives on the island, it will drive my son, right? It'll be his main driving factor. It'll terrify him. The story unfolds with other terrifying things, like on the head of a stick is placed a wild boar head that the boys kill, and there's flies buzzing around the head of this pig head. That's where the name Lord of the Flies comes from. Other images of bullying before bullying was a formidable foe. Bullying was just terrifying the way the book describes it, and maybe many of you have lived it. Certainly kids today are living it. Maybe it was always a formidable foe. The book was written in 1954. The book kind of crescendos into a scene where Ralph, kind of the good guys, the good boys, are seeking to get the conch shell which was stolen from them and put Jack, the bad guy, in charge. They went to go retrieve it, and while they were there trying to retrieve it, the main kid named Piggy, who is picked on relentlessly throughout the whole book, is killed by a kid named Roger by dropping a stone on his head. A 10, 11-year-old boy kills another 10 and 11-year-old boy. It was terrifying to me. And Jack then tortures everyone. Tortures. 11-year-old boy torturing anyone who is not a part of his tribe, his savages. Anyone who was with Ralphie, he would capture and torture until they admitted that they would be part of Jack's tribe. And so Ralphie is alone, and Jack convinces all of his savage followers to chase Ralphie, to hunt him with spears with the intention to kill him. Oh, this was too much for my junior brain. I'm thinking about a ball that goes through a hoop and maybe some girls and maybe my faith with Jesus. This radically gave me nightmares. Thinking of a poor, helpless boy running for his life from his boyhood buddies. The end of the story ends abruptly and powerfully when the hunters have set the island ablaze on fire, and the island is burned to an ashy crisp. And they're able to identify Ralphie, and they're closing in on him, chasing him. And he has tripped and fallen, and when he looks back, he sees these savages, his boyhood buddies, closing in on him with spears to skewer him, right? And just before they do so, Ralph looks the other way, and he sees an adult, a naval officer in a uniform. And in that moment, everything shatters. Ralphie begins to sob the first time he can grieve the loss of his good friend Piggy because he died. The savages with the spears, they break. At the very presence and sight of an authoritative adult that's put in order, they begin erupting in sobs. Many lessons the story illustrates. Nonetheless, is the fact that that beast that they thought was out there, the beast was within them. And when there is no recognition of any authoritative presence in our life, what do? We do whatever we think is best. And so the beast ruins us and everyone else around us. What a powerful book that brought to home to me some deep realities of my faith. Judges 9 is the preamble, is maybe where Lord of the Flies came from. Judges chapter 9 is where we're at today. Judges 9 is a terrifying tale that mirrors the flow of the story, Lord of the Flies. It is meant to be just as powerful. It's only captured in 50 or so verses, not in 500 pages. But it's meant to be that powerful, that kind of story. It's meant to display to us what happens when God is edged out of our lives, subtly or overtly over time. Judges 9 is the edging out of God, the result when God is edged out of life, when God is edged out of society, when God is edged out of your individual life. And I say the edging out not just because I made it up, but you can tell is how Judges flows. Leading up to Judges chapter 9, it was the Gideon account, right? And if you notice, it went through this cycle. But in this cycle of Gideon, where it went through sin, punishment, they cried out and God brought relief, God was kind of present in chapter 6. And certainly God was present when he rose Gideon up to save. But in chapters 7 and 8, God is kind of moved to the periphery. He's not mentioned much. He's not inquired for much. He's not sought or prayed to or interacted with much compared to chapter 6. And there, right before it dives back into another cycle, we have Judges chapter 9, that little green cycle. There's like this mini cycle before it dives back into another flow. Because right after Judges 9, which would be out of that little green mini cycle, it flows back into sin in chapter 10 and 11 and 12. The cycle repeats. Chapter 9 of Judges is kind of like a pause to say, okay, when the nation of Israel goes back to sinning, when they edge God out of their life, like how bad is it really? Like how bad is it really? I don't know if you've ever experienced it. I don't know if you've ever wanted to wonder it. I don't know if you've been around church and Jesus and God stuff your whole life, and maybe at a period of your life you've taken up the opportunity of that temptation. Maybe you're considering it right now as a teenager or junior higher. But maybe you're saying this, I wonder what happens really if God isn't just on the periphery, but he's really just edged out of my life. Like how bad can it really be to live how I want to live, to function and interact the way I really want to act, without the authoritative presence or fearful idea that God may hold me to it one day? I would say a vast majority of people in our nation, for whatever reason, are succumbing to the temptation of let's get rid of the faithful roots of my life and let's just dabble in a lifestyle where God has been edged out. So in some ways, I think Judges 9 can also mirror us and be a healthy warning for us individually, but maybe also for our society. We'll see. Judges chapter 9 is that little green cycle. See, we're going to pull it out now. And we're going to see there is somewhat of a cycle here. I put a question mark on the cry out and the relief because when we read that, you'll be like, ooh, that I don't know if that would completely fall into the pattern, but you'll see the flow. Follow with me here. We're not going to read word for word, but I would say this. This is a story that is not well known, about a figure or character that we do not know well. Meaning Gideon, I kind of remember something about a fleece and some army goes down to 300 about Gideon. When we get to Samson, you'll know kind of his Delilah, wasn't he strong and hair and donkey jaw, right? Abimelech, even the most well-versed Bible knowledge folks are like, yeah, Abimelech, I don't have any connotations with him. That's Judges 9. It's a brand new story. I don't think many of us will know it by heart. And maybe there's a reason why we haven't memorized it. Maybe there's a reason why we should at least restore it in our spiritual memory. The death of Gideon occurs after the rest of 40 years in verse 28 of chapter 8. Chapter 8, verse 29 to 32 records Gideon's death. And then it says this in verse 33. As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. Verse 34, and the people of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hand of all their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Gideon, Jerubbaal, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. So that's the sin portion that we're entering into and saying, how bad is it really if people return, they sin, they forget about God, they forget to honor those that God has used in the past? What happens? So now we enter chapter 9, and we'll kind of move through these 50 verses, not necessarily quickly, but maybe just not word for word. It begins with the introduction of the character Abimelech. He's the son of Gideon. he goes to Shechem, it says, to his mother's relatives, and he says to them, and the whole clan of his mother's family. So you can just follow me, verse 1. We're going to start just walking through here. We'll go slower through the first, really 21 verses, and then we'll move quicker through the rest of the chapter. He says this in verse 2. Say, he says to his relatives, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Gideon rule over you? Jerubbaal? Gideon had 70 sons, and they were somewhat ruling over the people. Or, he says, is it better that one rule over you? Me, right? He says, me, Abimelech. And then he just throws this zinger in there. Remember, I'm your family. I'm your bone and your flesh. I'm your relative, right? His mother's, verse 3, relatives spoke all these words on Abimelech's behalf in the ears of the leaders of Shechem. And then it says this, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he's our brother. I guess he should be our king. Like, what a flippant way to appoint someone into a kingly role, right? So already, hopefully you experience this. The ambition of Abimelech, right? You see that. He's going after that king of the hill type position. I want to be king. He's manipulating his relatives to do his bidding, and he's convincing the leaders of Shechem, but it isn't just Abimelech's sin that's we're going to be dealing with. The leaders of Shechem, it says, their hearts inclined to follow him without much discernment, right? And we're going to see the hearts of the leaders of Shechem do this to various people. Their heart's just inclined to follow him with no discernment. And then when they don't like that, they go and their heart just, without discerning, follows somebody else. And it's a big deal, and it's a big sin. Verse 4, it says this, these leaders gave Abimelech 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired what? Worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. 1 Corinthians 15:33, right? You know that verse? Bad company corrupts good character. It's a good parenting verse, isn't it? Choose your friends wisely. You can have the best character in the world. Maybe let's give Abimelech the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he has a little bit of Gideon, who wasn't great in and of himself. When he has a little bit of Gideon in and of himself, he's a good-natured boy at this point maybe. But he surrounds himself with bad company. And they really work to take him down. It says this, and Abimelech went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. Okay, here's where the story gets interesting right from the get-go, right? Execution style, here's a stone, one at a time. He killed his brothers on a stone. 70 of them. 70 of his brothers he killed. Who helped him do it? Not just the reckless fellows, but those leaders of Shechem. The leaders were there with him. The middle of verse 5 reads, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself, and all the leaders of Shechem came together. They went and made Abimelech king. But look at verse 7. When it was told to Jotham, he went and he stood on top of Mount Gerizim, and he cried aloud to them. He gives them a fable, he gives them a parable. He says, listen, you leaders of Shechem. And he speaks right to the leaders of Shechem. He isn't even addressing Abimelech, which he kind of is indirectly. He says this, you leaders of Shechem, oh, that God may listen to you. The trees, this is a story of fable, the trees once went out to anoint a king over them. And they looked at the olive tree, which was used in that part of the region for a lot of different things. Oh, a good tree. They went to the olive tree, hey, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance by which goods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? Basically, no, I won't reign over you. That's not my place. They go to the fig tree. Come, reign over us. And the fig tree is like, no, that's not my place. I have another place. I have other things I'm supposed to do. Verse 12, they go to the vine. Come, reign over us. And the vine's like, no, I will not reign over you. I reject the office of kingship in this manner. Verse 14, then all these trees said to the bramble, it's like a wild bush, so not really a tree, but they say this, you come and reign over us. And the bramble entertains the offer, it says. He says, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. It's a strange strange image, but how could a bramble provide good, healthy shade for a forest of trees? I don't know. It's part of the fable, right? It says, but if you have not done it in good faith, let fire, a key theme, come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Who's the bramble? Abimelech. Who are the cedars of Lebanon, the trees? The leaders of Shechem. Jotham translates it for him in verse 16. Now therefore, if you, leaders of Shechem, have acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you've dealt well, key here, with Gideon, Jerubbaal, and his house, and have done to him as his deeds deserved. And then he goes on this rant, assuming that he does not think they've honored Gideon well. For my father fought to you, risked his life, delivered you from the hand of the Midianites. You've risen up against my father's house this day. You've killed 70 of his sons on one stone. Zebul, who was with Abimelech, tries to quiet down. Oh, sorry, not yet. He reinforces this at the end of verse 18 and says, so if in good faith, verse 18, you really made Abimelech king, or if you haven't, if you've just done it because he's your relative, have you ever shown favoritism with no discernment? Because, well, you know the person, he's a relative, you know, it's a good old boy system, right? It's like right here. It's like not a good thing. Jotham says, if you've done all of this in good faith, great, rejoice. Verse 20. But if you've not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem. And then let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and devour Abimelech. And then Jotham ran away because he knew Abimelech, his brother, would find out that he was hiding and he'd kill him. So there's a fable. And then it says in verse 22 that Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. Very short time. A lot of damage can be done in a very short amount of time. 40 years of peace is completely destroyed in just a short 3 years. See, what happens is Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem turn on one another. And they begin to just go after one another. And you think about the fable that Jotham said, it's playing out. His fable is coming true. It wasn't done in a good way. None of this was done in a good way. There's a man who steps in, verse 26, his name is Gaal. And he steps in with his relatives into Shechem, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. They don't like Abimelech anymore. They turn to this new leader, give their hearts to him, right? And his intention, you can see verses 28 and 29, is to remove Abimelech as king. Of course, Abimelech isn't going to have anything of this. He has spies. Verse 30, Zebul, his kind of ruler of the city, hears about this effort, and he helps Abimelech take over Gaal, to where we see in verse 40 that Abimelech chases this guy out, and eventually he's driven out, this Gaal and all of his relatives. But Abimelech knows the leaders of Shechem betrayed him, so you know what he does, verses 42 and 43, he closes in on Shechem while all the people are in their fields. He takes the city, it says, verse 44. He captures the city. Look at verse 46 now. We'll slow down here. All the leaders of Shechem heard that Abimelech had taken the city, and so they entered the stronghold, fortified kind of tower-looking thing. They all just crammed in there in the center of the city, seeking protection. And Abimelech grabs an axe, goes out and cuts a wild bush like a bramble, right? He lays it at the bottom and says, "Everyone, go cut down your own bush or bramble and lay it at the foot of this strong tower where all the leaders are hiding." And they all do that. And what does he do? He sets it ablaze. And it says in that one blaze, 1,000 men and women, the leaders of Shechem and all of their families, died by fire. Died by fire. Wow. I mean, Abimelech seems to be the hero. Look at verse 50. Abimelech's ambition continues to drive him. He goes to the city called Thebez. He encamps there. He captures it. Once again, there's a strong tower within the city. All the men and women and all the leaders flee to it, and they shut themselves in. And they went up to the roof of the tower. You know what's going to happen. This is like deja vu. Abimelech pushes to draw near the door, verse 52 says, because his intention is to do what? Burn it down with fire. It worked last time. It's certainly going to work this time. But what if last time wasn't just his own smart concoction of a strategy? What if it was really only blessed by God, only allowed by God? Verse 53 alludes to this. It says, as they approached near the door at the bottom of the tower, it says, a certain woman, doesn't even name the woman. It isn't because the woman isn't important. It's a way to really defame Abimelech. A certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. He calls to his armor bearer. He says, "Kill me. I don't want it to be known that a woman killed him," but we got this account, so we all know what happened to Abimelech. It says in verse 55, a key verse, when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. This is the opposite of what has happened before. Usually, as long as the judge, like Gideon, is alive, there's peace. And when the judge dies, then it's chaos. Here, this story, as long as Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem are alive, it is chaos. But as soon as they die, there's peace. The wars, the fighting, the destruction stop. It's almost like when Abimelech dies, the people have something removed from their spiritual sight, and they say, "What are we doing? What have we done?" And they go back. Very similar to the Lord of the Flies feel, right? In kind of us retelling this, I've left out a few key verses. So far, you feel it. There is no mention of God. None. But for a couple verses. These are key verses in this story. It says, "And God sent an evil spirit that the violence might be done would come again." Very early on, when Abimelech starts ruling, God's sending of an evil spirit is actually what causes Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem to devour each other. Imagine if the evil spirit was not sent and Abimelech worked in beautiful union and unity with the leaders of Shechem. The destruction would have been 10 times as much. They would have created a formidable union, and they, with unreserved ambition, would have destroyed anyone in their path. God sent an evil spirit so that that wouldn't happen, and so that their sins would catch up with them. How do you feel about that? God taking care of evil. How do you feel about that? Verse 56 and 57 give a beautiful, concise summary of what has happened. Thus, God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. God returned the evil. God returned the evil. The title of the sermon is Redeeming Retribution. This is a chapter that speaks about divine retribution. And where we begin, if we're going to begin to process retribution, which if you think about retribution, it's kind of a way of saying what you have been sowing will come around back to you. It's you will be repaid for the evil or the good done to you. You will be rewarded or repaid depending on what suits you. And when we talk about divine retribution, we speak of a God who's that authoritative presence that maintains some order just by the fact that he will bring retribution. But if that idea is edged out of our conscious awareness, chaos. Evil will be done at an alarming rate. There's an article, a phenomenal article, written, and it says, Divine Retribution, a Forgotten Doctrine. And it chronicles how divine retribution as a doctrine has been present, fairly present, until the age of the Enlightenment, especially the 20th century. And it chronicles how when this doctrine has been edged out, usually ungodliness characterizes the nation or even the church. When we start to talk about retribution, we start here with just simple principles. Sin deserves justice. When we began and we heard about Abimelech killing his 70 brothers, I'll ask it this way. Does killing 70 people execution style, serial murder style, what does it deserve? I hope anyone would see the common sense of it deserves some type of justice, right? Like, I hope our society hasn't become so degraded to where people would potentially throw up the option of, well, maybe that doesn't deserve justice. I hope we haven't gotten there. What about this? When the leaders of Shechem have their hearts inclined to a man to be their leader, and they appoint him and they decide to follow him, the one who serial-like kills 70 of his siblings, what do they deserve? These are leaders who are supposed to lead with discernment. What do they deserve? I hope once again there is a sense in us that justice. They deserve justice. Romans speaks of the wages of sin, or in another word, what sin deserves. What does sin deserve? The wages of sin is death. Sin deserves justice. Imagine if justice is edged out of our understanding of who God is. what a nightmarish feeling to think that sin would go unpunished. That sin might not be held in check. That we might begin to think that sin deserves an applause rather than justice. Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good." Sin deserves justice. Now you may be thinking, well, who earns the right to give the justice? I know that's what maybe we're most concerned about. Well, we have a God of the Bible who is a God of mercy. But he would not be a God of mercy if he was not a God of justice. Let me throw a phrase out there to you. Could there possibly be mercy if there was no justice? If there was no standard, how would a student know when a teacher's being merciful to them? Let's say in the educational realm, there was no justice, no retribution, meaning poor effort and a poor working knowledge of whatever is to be learned resulted in a A+. Can you imagine if our educational system did that? That is 2 + 2 = 5. You're wrong, but we're going to reward you with an A. Can you imagine? You know what would happen? A teacher would be stripped of the opportunity to come alongside that student to say, let me work with you. Let me go be above and beyond what justice calls for and display mercy to you by spending time with you and to make sure that you get this so that I can give you an A. Imagine if there was no standard, we would never experience mercy. Never experience mercy. In any self-description in the Old Testament, God doesn't just describe himself as a wrathful God or as a blind doormat kind of God who gives out grace. He's both. He's both. And the last principle is this: retribution is part of redemption. One day God is going to come again, and his son Jesus is going to be sent and come again. And in that day, the Word of God tells us that he's going to make everything right. It's another way of describing what retribution is. Everything will be made right. Every wrong done will be repaid. And every right done will be rewarded. And all the innocent sufferings that none of us deserved will be taken away. And some of the consequences that God has not dished out on those who have refused to acknowledge him because of his mercy will then be handed out and delivered. That's future retribution. Currently, right now, retribution occurs. God does things in our day and age. He steps in. He sends evil spirits. He returns evil upon people. Instead of reading into every natural disaster and linking a specific sin to it, like some evangelical leaders do, and I would say it's wrong for us to do it, we do not have the theologizing of Judges 9 to link it to the specific sin. They dishonored Gideon. That's why God punished them. When an earthquake comes and hits a region, I don't know what sin that God is maybe repaying that nation for. I'm not going to go that far. John 9 also alludes to us that sometimes even sickness comes, but it's not linked to someone's sin or the sin of their fathers or mothers. We just need to acknowledge that in our day and age, while there are a lot of natural reasons for certain things to occur, certain calamities, we cannot rule out the hand or the finger of God. We must acknowledge there might be spiritual reasons. And God may be currently fleshing out retribution. And that should lead us to humble ourselves just at the sight of his authoritative presence. But lastly, I'll say this: retribution occurred on that day in the past, right? There on the cross of Jesus Christ, God displayed perfectly mercy and justice. When Hebrews 9:14 says, he offered himself, and there God poured out all of his wrath, justful wrath for the sins of the world, so that many might receive his mercy and be saved from any kind of retribution forever and ever. Amen.